Hello everyone, this is Graeme Anderson from Four Corners of the Board, and today I'm going to be looking at Killing Code Venice Vendetta. Now for the last couple of years, before the Essen Game Fair begins, I make a list of my most anticipated games that are going to be coming out at the fair. Last year, this game made my list. Now one player takes the role of a killer and chooses one of the characters of Venice to become their surrogate, or the killer. Over 5 nights, they will attempt to kill the other inhabitants without getting caught. Now when I first read up on the game and saw that everyone knew which player was the killer, but not which character of Venice they controlled, it intrigued me, as I've always enjoyed hidden movement or, hidden knowledge games in which you are trying to figure out who done it. So, did this game live up to my expectations? Let's get to the table, see how it's played, then we'll come back for my final thoughts on Killing Code Venice Vendetta. Oh, and did I mention, it comes with a mask. So here we have Killing Code set up for 4 players. You will randomly decide who the killer will be, and the other players will be the investigators. You will then place all the character standees onto the board following the rulebook. The killer will then shuffle the character cards and draw 2 off the top. Choose one and return the other to the bottom of the deck. This character card will be the suspect who is doing the killing, and is who the investigators are trying to find. The killer will then place the killer card on top of the chosen character card, just so it doesn't get mixed up with the other cards. The killer is then given their killing cards, and finally a scenario is chosen. And there will be additional rules and or setup that is required, but I'm not going to go into the specifics during this walkthrough. The game is now ready to start. It is played over 5 rounds, and each round has 3 phases. The first phase is the killer dealing out the suspect cards. They will shuffle the deck and deal out a number of cards depending on the number of players. For a 4-player game, where there are 3 investigators and 1 killer, they will deal out 6 cards. This way, each investigator will activate 1 suspect card, and then the first investigator will activate a second one. So 4 out of the 6 suspects will be activated by the investigators. Once the cards are dealt out, we move to the investigators phase. In this phase, the investigators will choose, in player order, which suspects they will move. Now let's have a quick look at the suspect cards. Here you will see the movement points. This is how many blocks the character can move, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. You'll also see their gender, which is usually tied to killing cards and or scenarios. Their class, such as noble, citizen, etc., which again is tied to certain killing cards and or scenarios. And finally, their special ability. Now, if there's an arrow beside their ability, it means that it is an active ability, and that when this suspect is chosen to be activated, you will decide if you want to use that ability. If there's no arrow, it means it's passive, and will always be active. The special ability text will give you the details on how and when you can use the ability. Now, let's get back to the game board. When an investigator chooses a suspect card to activate, they'll place it in front of them. When you activate a suspect, it will usually be to move them to another location. If you are using their normal movement, that is, you're not using their special ability, then each movement point the character has will move them 1 block. Well, what's a block? Let's take a closer look at the board. The board represents the city of Venice, made up of areas. And each area is a different color and has a different symbol. Within each area, there are blocks. Blocks are separated from each other by bridges or canals, and each block has 3 spaces. During normal movement, green bridges are passable and red bridges are not. There are also canal routes on the board, and each area will have a clock tower. Now let's get back to the gameplay. When you do a normal movement with a character, you'll move it to an adjacent block with the following rules. If all the spaces are full within a block, you cannot enter it. If some of the spaces are full with other suspects, you must stop, even if you have more movement points. If none of the spaces are full, you can continue your movement if you have any movement points left over. If the suspect's special ability has the word direct in it, it usually means you can ignore some or all of the restrictions, but again, the special ability will tell you how to use it. Now, once each investigator has activated a suspect or suspects, depending on the number of players, the killer will act in the final phase. The killer will either choose the 2 remaining suspects to move, or they will choose one of the suspects already activated by a player to move. They will follow exactly the same rules for the suspect as if the investigator had picked the suspect. Once the killer has activated the desired suspects, they will choose one of the killing cards and activate it to kill the suspects on the board. Let's just take a quick look at some examples of the killing cards. Now, once the killing card has been chosen, the killer will don the mask and turns the suspect standee on their back for the suspects that have just been killed. The killer will then remove those just killed cards from the character deck and place them face up on the appropriate knight's track. Then they will place the killing card face down. The investigators do not get to know how the suspects died, only which suspects have died. Remove the appropriate cards from the suspect deck as well so they do not get mixed up. Now, when there is a dead suspect or suspects on the board, if the player activates a living suspect and moves them through or ends their movement in a block with a killed character, they can flip over the killing card associated with that death to find out how they died. Essentially, that now ends the round, and if this is the end of the 5th round, or the killer has already killed 5 suspects, you go into the final round, where the players will attempt to figure out which suspect the killer is using. Now, if the players have figured it out and they make a correct accusation, they've won. If their accusation is incorrect, then the killer wins. I should also mention that the investigators did not need to wait until the end of the game to guess the killer. But the group only gets one guess. If you guess early and are incorrect, the game is over and the killer wins. Now, I've given you the basics of the game, but note that the scenario that you pick may change the victory or defeat conditions for either or both sides. So that scenario-specific rule will always override these basic rules. And with that, let's get back to the table to see what I thought about Killing Code Venice Vendetta. So, what did I think about Killing Code Venice Vendetta? Well, let's first talk about the theme and the components. The theme of the game is an interesting one, and although I have seen it before, it worked well for me in the context of the game. The idea that one of the characters in the city is a killer and having to try and stop them was a good one. I also did like that the different end goals were available, and it did make the game feel different from game to game. Now, the components. I both really like them, but some of the design decisions really ended up annoying me. Now, first of all, let's talk about the art. The art on these cards is kind of indicative of the entire game, and I thought it was very well done. Now, I like the board, it's easy to read, and all the spaces are both color and symbolized, which made it much easier to find out where the characters are. Now, the standees. Again, good and bad things about them. If you look at the art, I quite like the art on these standees, but you'll notice that these are quite dark. Now, you'll also notice that the name is across the bottom. If I put them in the standees, you will notice that the kind of name disappears. People are constantly having to kind of tilt these to find out who they are because they are dark. It's very hard to see. I really wish they had put a kind of big number on top of the standee so they made it much easier to find out. Another problem with the component is the rulebook. Now, the version I have has one major game-breaking error in it, and it's a good thing it is fairly easy to catch. The rulebook refers to both decks of cards as the same thing. And the first time we played strictly by the rules in the book, and I said, you know, it didn't make much logical sense, and the game was an utter failure. We replayed the game with the way I thought the rules should be, and it worked out great. Now, needless to say, there is a version 2 of the rulebook on BoardGameGeek that corrects this issue. Another issue I had with the rulebook was the initial placement of the characters. It's not printed anywhere on the board or on the standees themselves. You have to refer back to the rulebook each time you play to find out where they start. And there are a fair number of standees, so it's not that easy to memorize them. And it doesn't change from scenario to scenario, so I'm not really sure why they did this. Okay, one last nitpick with the components. There is one scenario that requires the killer to put little masks on all of the standees. This is a neat idea, and they look good, but the masks are too small and fiddly. Oh my gosh, they were annoying to kind of put on. You have to hook them around the back and put them on the standees. Just annoying. And as for the mask, well, you know what? It's completely superfluous to the game. But that didn't stop each and every person who played the killer putting this on when they were killing someone. So anyway, let's get on to the gameplay. The gameplay was something I really enjoyed. I like hidden movement and hidden role games. This one is a bit different. Everyone knows who is playing the killer. They all know what the killer's objectives is. The only thing they don't know is which of the standees on the board the killer has chosen. One of the big pluses for me in the overall is the overall game length. Now, it's only 5 nights long and then it's done. I like that. It also means that there are more people in my game group willing to play them. Some of them are really not big fans of one versus many hidden information games, but when I tell them it's less than an hour, you know what, they are willing to try, and that makes it a big plus for me. For the mechanisms, I thought it was a really good move to have the killer card be random. They draw 2 cards off the deck and pick one of them to keep. It makes it harder for them to kind of pre-select who they want to be. The mechanism of dealing out the character cards and only having those characters move is another interesting aspect of the game. It really limits both the players and the killer. The players want to move characters around so they can either investigate a murder or separate them so it's harder for the killer to act. Conversely, the killer wants to move the characters to make it easier to kill or make it less obvious how the person was killed. But for both sides, if the character cards aren't dealt out, you have to deal with what you have. And unfortunately, I never ran into a situation where the killer could not kill anyone. The character's special abilities are also well done, and I felt, for the most part, thematic to the characters and very useful in certain situations. Once you know the special abilities and the other ways to move around the board, such as canals for example, you need to learn to use their characters to the fullest of capabilities. Now when we first played, we were just kind of using the normal movement points, which is necessary at some points, but never forget about the other options. They're vitally important. Now being the killer seems to have the right amount of stress for my group. It is stressful, but not as much as something like a Letter from Whitechapel or like a Battlestar Galactica. It is still tense, but because more is known, it just seems to feel, to more members of the group, that was a more enjoyable stress. Now, I've said a lot of good things about the game, but one of my biggest negatives of the game is actually the downtime. There are essentially 2 halves to every round, and it's very difficult to pre-plan. The players can't know who they will move until the cards are dealt out. Then of course there's a discussion on who should move which character where. During this, the killer has very little to do. They really can't make their decision until all the players have gone. And once all the players have gone, they kind of sit back and wait for the killer to figure out what they want to do. Both sides have periods of just waiting for the other side to make their move. Now it's unavoidable, but it was something that was brought up a few times with my playgroup. One of the other negatives is the lack of snares in the game. There are only 5 scenarios. Now, if you are planning to play, each person wants to play the killer and all the scenarios, there's going to be enough, but I just really wish there were more. Now, I did like that kind of almost every scenario had a different way to play. So the basic rules are the same, but what you have to achieve changes. And another negative or positive, depending on which way you look at it, is the necessity to remember the board state. Since you do not know how a person was killed until one of the players investigates the murder, you need to remember what characters were where at the time of the murder. If the killer card says that the killer had to be the next block, who was there? Do you remember? I felt it would be kind of unfair to the killer to keep notes at each night. But boy, sometimes it was difficult to really remember what characters were where. Now I enjoyed it as I have a fairly good memory, but some of my game group did find it a little frustrating, and we definitely flailed a scenario because we remembered things incorrectly. Now for my final verdict. You know what? I really would recommend this game. I ended up really thoroughly enjoying it. It's a good length, albeit with some downtime. I would like more scenarios, as the ones included are good and varied, and it was enjoyed by all the people I played with, even those who don't like the longer, more stressful one versus many games. And that's it for the moment. Until next time, thanks for watching.
Thanks so much for watching the Dice Tower videos. Find more great videos and reviews, as well as our top-rated audio podcast at Dicetower.com. You can also find other great shows at Dicetowernetwork.com. I'm Eric Summerer, and you've been watching The Dice Tower. The Dice Tower is sponsored by Cool Stuff Inc., where you can find great games for great prices. Cool stuff in stock. Check them out at CoolStuffInc.com.